Can you take my dog instead of me? The man sitting on the bench slowly lowered his newspaper. Dog, he said, blinking once in confusion. A dog? You mean, that dog? His eyes moved down to the tiny bundle tucked inside the girl's sweater. And why? He added, leaning back slightly. Would I have to take your dog instead of you? The late afternoon sunlight stretched across Riverside Park in long golden bands. Annie Carter stood a few steps in front of the bench. In her arms was a tiny golden puppy wrapped carefully inside her sweater. The puppy's nose poked out, twitching softly as it breathed. My family can't keep him, she said. The man studied her with mild curiosity. Oh, Annie nodded. My mom works a lot, she explained, and our apartment is really small. The building doesn't allow pets, and we don't have enough money for dog food or a doctor if he gets sick. She looked down at the puppy as she spoke. But I couldn't leave him there. Where did you find him? The man asked. By the sidewalk when I was walking home from school, Annie said. He was lying in the grass by himself. She pointed toward the edge of the park. He was making tiny crying sounds, like he was scared. The puppy stirred slightly in her arms, as if remembering. So, you picked him up, the man said. Yes. And brought him home. Yes. And your mother said no. Yes. Annie didn't sound angry about it, just sad. The man nodded slowly. That sounds like a responsible mother. Annie gave a small shrug. She felt bad too, she said. But we just can't take care of him the way he deserves. The puppy shifted again, pushing its tiny head further out of the sweater. Oh, Annie added suddenly, brightening a little. His name is Lulu. The man raised an eyebrow. Lulu? I named him, Annie said proudly. Because when I first picked him up, he made a little Lulu sound. The puppy gave a sleepy yawn, as if agreeing with the story. The man glanced at the dog again. Well, Lulu seems comfortable, he said. Annie nodded. He's really sweet. There was a short pause before she asked the question again. So will you take him? The man sighed softly. I'm afraid not. Annie blinked. Why not? The man folded his newspaper carefully and placed it beside him. I don't like dogs, he said calmly. Annie looked genuinely surprised. You don't? No. Why? The man hesitated briefly. When I was about your age, he said, a neighbor's dog bit me pretty badly. Annie's eyes widened. Really? Really? It hurt? Quite a lot. He rubbed his left forearm unconsciously where the faint scar still existed. So ever since then, he continued, I've stayed away from dogs. Annie looked down at Lulu. Well, Lulu is too little to bite like that. The man almost smiled. That may be true, he said. But I'm still not the right person. He gestured lightly toward the street beyond the park. There are animal shelters in the city. They help dogs find homes. Annie shook her head slowly. I thought about that. And? My friend at school said sometimes the shelters are very full, Annie said quietly. And sometimes dogs get scared there. She held Lulu closer. I don't want Lulu to be scared. The man studied her again. Well, maybe you could give him to someone else, he suggested. A neighbor, perhaps. Annie looked around the park. There were more people earlier, she said. And? They all walked away fast. The man nodded. So you picked me, he said. Annie nodded. You were sitting here by yourself. That's not much of a qualification. Annie tilted her head thoughtfully. You look like a good person. The man didn't respond to that. The puppy shifted again. Its tiny paw slipped out from the sweater sleeve and trembled slightly. The man noticed. Is Lulu cold? He asked. A little. The sun was dropping lower now, and the breeze carried a sharper chill. Annie walked over to the bench. Before the man could react, she gently placed Lulu into his lap. The movement was quick but careful. Lulu blinked up at him. For a moment the man froze. Every instinct from childhood told him to move away, but Lulu didn't bark. The puppy simply leaned forward and gave the man's hand a small lick. Then Lulu circled twice on the man's coat and curled into a warm ball. Within seconds, the puppy was asleep. The man stared down at the tiny dog. Its breathing was slow and peaceful. Annie watched his face. Then she said quietly, You know, you look like someone who doesn't have anyone sitting next to them. The man glanced up. Annie pointed at the empty space beside him on the bench. My grandpa used to say people shouldn't sit alone too much, she added. She gently pushed Lulu a little closer into his lap. It would be really nice, Annie said softly, if you had a friend to walk with. The wind moved through the trees again, scattering leaves across the path. The man sat very still. Instead, he sat on a park bench with a sleeping puppy named Lulu in his lap. while a little girl stood in front of him, waiting to see if he would change his mind. Lulu stirred slightly in Ethan Caldwell's arms. The tiny puppy had not moved much since Annie placed him there. Curled against Ethan's coat, he looked as though he had belonged there his entire life. Ethan looked down at the little animal with a mixture of confusion and reluctant curiosity. "Well," he murmured quietly, "this is not how I planned my afternoon." Across from him, Annie stood patiently with her hands folded behind her back. She didn't rush him. Children sometimes understood something. Adults forgot important decisions needed silence first. Lulu's ear twitched. Ethan hesitated, then slowly reached down and gently brushed his fingers across the puppy's head. The fur was soft, warmer than he expected. Lulu responded instantly, stretching his neck and letting out a tiny, satisfied sigh before pushing his nose deeper into Ethan's coat. Ethan froze. "That," he said quietly, glancing up at Annie, "was purely accidental." Annie smiled. "You're petting him." "I absolutely am not. You just did." Ethan looked back down at the puppy. "Well, maybe once." He carefully rubbed Lulu's head again, slower this time, testing the feeling like someone touching water for the first time. Lulu's tail wagged lazily against Ethan's coat. Ethan muttered. "That means he likes you," Annie said. "So you've mentioned." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan straightened slightly. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "since this appears to have become a formal meeting, introductions might be appropriate." Annie blinked. Ethan gave a small nod. "My name is Ethan Caldwell." Annie repeated it carefully. "Ethan, Mr. Caldwell usually," he added with a faint smile. She nodded again. "My name is Annie." "Annie what?" "Annie Carter." "Well, Annie Carter," Ethan said, "you have put me in a rather unusual situation." Annie looked down at Lulu. "I know." Ethan glanced back toward the path where joggers occasionally passed. "You mentioned earlier your family can't keep him." Annie nodded. "Our apartment building doesn't allow pets," she explained again. "And my mom says dogs need food, and doctor visits, and toys, and lots of time." All accurate statements. "She works 2 jobs sometimes." Ethan's expression shifted slightly. "What does your mother do?" "She helps people at the hospital," Annie said. "She says she's not the doctor, but she helps the doctors." "A nurse's aide?" "I think so." "That's hard work." Annie nodded. "That's why I can't ask her to take care of Lulu too." Ethan looked down at the puppy again. Lulu had now rolled slightly onto his back, exposing his tiny belly in complete trust. "Ethan Sahid, you realize," he said slowly, "that taking responsibility for a dog is a serious commitment." Annie nodded. "I know." "And you believe I'm the right candidate for that commitment?" "Yes." "Based on what evidence?" Annie thought for a moment. "You didn't move him away." Ethan looked down again. "Well, he seems comfortable." Lulu shifted again and pressed his tiny paw against Ethan's hand. Without thinking, Ethan gently scratched behind the puppy's ear. Lulu let out a soft, happy grunt. Ethan glanced up quickly, realizing what he had just done. "That was also accidental," he said. Annie giggled. "You're getting better at it." Ethan shook his head. "You are a very persuasive young negotiator, Annie Carter. My teacher says I ask too many questions." "In my experience," Ethan said, "that's usually how smart people start." "My bus stop is near the corner," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her. "You take the bus home alone?" "Sometimes. And today? I walked." "Why?" "I wanted to make sure Lulu found someone." If this moment between Annie and Lulu touched your heart, please take a second to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. Your support helps these stories reach more people. And if you are, believe kindness still matters. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories like this. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. The girl had carried this small animal across half the neighborhood just to make sure it would be safe. "That's a lot of responsibility for someone your age," he said. Annie shrugged. "He was smaller than me." Ethan chuckled softly. "That is a surprisingly logical explanation." They both looked down at Lulu again. The puppy was still sleeping peacefully in Ethan's lap. "Does Lulu always fall asleep this fast?" Ethan asked. "He was scared earlier," Annie said. "I think he feels safe now." Ethan considered that quietly. Safe. It had been a long time since that word meant anything to him. "Annie," Ethan said after a moment, "are you absolutely certain there isn't someone else who could take Lulu?" Annie shook her head. "I asked 2 people before you, and they said they were busy." Ethan nodded slowly. That sounded about right for most people in a city. Well, he said, glancing down at the puppy again. Lulu appears to have made his own decision. Annie smiled. He picked you. Ethan sighed. But there was a faint hint of amusement in his voice now. That may be the most irresponsible hiring process I've ever witnessed. Annie laughed softly. The sound was bright and honest. For a moment, Ethan simply listened. Then he looked down again at Lulu and gently stroked the puppy's back once more. The little tail wagged. All right, Lulu, Ethan murmured quietly. The puppy twitched in his sleep. I suppose we should discuss your future. Annie watched him carefully. Hope flickered across her face. The evening breeze rolled in from the lake, carrying the cool promise of night. The sun had almost reached the edge of the trees when Annie began walking toward the park gate. Ethan Caldwell remained on the bench. Lulu was still asleep in his lap. For a long moment, Ethan simply watched the small golden puppy breathe. The rhythm was slow and peaceful, completely unaware that his future was being quietly negotiated in the middle of Riverside Park. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. Well, he muttered softly, this is a strange situation. Lulu's tail twitched. Ethan looked down again. The puppy had rolled slightly onto his side, one tiny paw resting against Ethan's wrist. Without really thinking about it, Ethan gently ran his fingers along Lulu's back again. The puppy let out a small, contented sound. Ethan stopped immediately. You're very manipulative for someone who weighs 3 pounds, he said quietly. Behind him, the park path crunched lightly. Ethan turned. Annie had stopped walking. She stood halfway down the path, looking back toward him. You're still petting him, she said. Ethan cleared his throat. I'm evaluating him. For what? For behavioral stability. Annie walked back a few steps toward the bench. And? Ethan glanced down again. Preliminary results suggest he is extremely lazy. Annie smiled. He had a big day. That's true. Ethan sat forward slightly. You know something, Annie Carter? What? You are very confident leaving a dog with a complete stranger. Annie shrugged. You told me your name. That does not qualify as a background check. But you told the truth. Ethan tilted his head. How do you know that? My mom says people who lie don't usually say their names first. Ethan let out a quiet laugh. Your mother sounds like a very practical person. She is. Lulu shifted again and pressed his nose deeper into Ethan's coat. Ethan glanced toward the park entrance. Do you live nearby? He asked. Annie pointed toward a row of apartment buildings beyond the street. Over there. That's a decent walk. I walk it every day. Ethan nodded. You're a brave kid. I had Lulu with me today. That helps. The wind drifted through the trees again. The sky above the lake had begun turning a deep amber. Annie stepped closer to the bench again. Do you travel a lot? She asked. Ethan looked up. Yes. For work? Yes. What do you do? Ethan thought for a moment. I move things. Like trucks? Yes. Big trucks? Very big trucks. Annie considered that carefully. My grandpa used to say trucks mean business. Your grandpa sounds like he understood the economy. Annie nodded proudly. He fixed engines. That explains it. Lulu suddenly stretched, waking slightly. The puppy blinked up at Ethan, confused for a moment. Then his tail began wagging. Ethan hid. Well, he said softly. Good evening to you too. The puppy licked Ethan's wrist. Once, then again. Ethan squinted at him. That is not an appropriate greeting protocol. Annie giggled. He's saying hello. He already said hello earlier. He likes saying it again. Ethan gently lifted Lulu a few inches and looked at him. You realize this is extremely irregular, he said to the puppy. Lulu responded by wagging harder. Ethan lowered him back into his lap. Annie watched carefully. You didn't give him back, she observed. That was a temporary repositioning. Sure. Ethan leaned back again on the bench. You know, Annie, I haven't owned a dog in my entire life. You said one bit you. Yes. Maybe Lulu is apologizing for that dog. Ethan paused. That is a surprisingly thoughtful interpretation. Annie looked down at the puppy. He looks sorry. Lulu sneezed softly. Ethan chuckled under his breath. Well, Lulu, he said, your public relations strategy is impressive. Annie sat carefully on the far edge of the bench now. Ethan noticed but didn't comment. For a moment the three of them simply sat there. The lake breeze carried the smell of water and autumn leaves. A man walked his golden retriever along the path nearby. Lulu lifted his head slightly to watch. Ethan noticed something then. The bench no longer felt empty. For years, Ethan had sat in parks, airports, boardrooms, and restaurants by himself without thinking about it. Solitude had become routine, efficient, predictable. But now there was a small girl beside him and a tiny dog curled against his coat, and somehow the quiet felt different. "Annie," Ethan said after a moment. "Yes. What happens if I say no?" Annie thought about that. "I'll keep looking." "For how long?" "Until someone says yes. And if nobody does?" Annie looked down at Lulu. Then she answered honestly, "Then I'll try again tomorrow." Ethan studied her face. There was no drama there, just determination. "You really don't want to leave him alone again?" he said. "No." "Why?" Annie shrugged gently. "Because someone left him once already." The words were simple, but they landed heavily. Ethan looked down at Lulu again. The puppy had curled up once more, completely relaxed. Trusting. Without thinking, Ethan began lightly scratching the puppy's neck. Lulu's tail thumped softly against Ethan's coat. Annie watched quietly. "You're getting good at that," she said. Ethan hid. "Yes," he admitted. "I appear to be improving." The sun slipped behind the trees. The first evening lights of the city flickered on in the distance. Ethan looked toward the skyline, then back at the little dog. "Well," he said slowly, "this may require a trial period." Annie's eyes widened slightly. "A trial period?" "Yes." "For Lulu?" "Yes." Annie smiled. "That sounds like a yes." Ethan shook his head. "That sounds like a temporary evaluation." Lulu wagged his tail. Annie stood up from the bench. "I think Lulu agrees." Ethan looked down at the puppy again. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan Caldwell felt something unfamiliar. Not responsibility, not pressure, something quieter. The feeling that perhaps this small, unexpected interruption in his perfectly structured life might actually be the beginning of something good. Ethan Caldwell did not make important decisions lightly. That had been true when he built his company, when he bought his first warehouse, when he fired people who failed him, and when he signed contracts worth more money than most families would see in 3 lifetimes. He believed in structure, in caution, in thinking 3 steps ahead. And yet, as he sat on a bench in Riverside Park with a puppy named Lulu asleep in his lap, none of that training seemed especially useful. The evening air had turned cooler. The last of the sunlight had faded from the lake, leaving the water dark and smooth beneath a pale sky. Streetlights had begun to glow along the path, soft and golden against the deepening blue. Annie stood beside the bench, hands folded in front of her now, watching Ethan with the patient seriousness only children could manage. "A trial period," she repeated, as though tasting the words. "Yes," Ethan said. "A temporary arrangement." Annie smiled a little. "That still sounds like a yes. It sounds like a cautious yes. That's still mostly a yes." Ethan looked at her, then at Lulu, then back at her. "You negotiate like an attorney." "My mom says I ask too many questions." "Your mother may be underestimating the scale of the problem." Annie giggled. It was a small sound, but bright. Ethan noticed how easily it changed the air around them. He had spent years in rooms where people laughed for strategic reasons. Investors laughed because they wanted something. Reporters laughed because they needed warmth before asking for something sharp. Even charity board members laughed with careful timing, aware of who was in the room and who might write a check. But Annie's laughter had none of that in it. It belonged entirely to the moment. Lulu stirred again and lifted his head. His ears twitched as though he had just remembered where he was. He blinked up at Ethan, yawned wide enough to show a row of tiny white teeth, then placed both front paws on Ethan's chest and licked his chin before Ethan could move away. Ethan recoiled slightly. "Oh no," he said, wiping his face with visible alarm. "Absolutely not." Annie burst into laughter again. "He likes you a lot. That is not the interpretation I would choose." Lulu wagged his tail so hard his whole body moved with it. Ethan sighed and picked the puppy up carefully, holding him out in front of him for inspection. Lulu looked back at him with complete innocence. "You," Ethan said, "appear to have no understanding of personal boundaries." Lulu sneezed. Annie nodded as if this proved something. "He's little. He doesn't know the rules yet. That makes 2 of us," Ethan muttered. He lowered the puppy back into his lap, though a little more carefully this time, as if he were already learning where Lulu fit best. Annie took a small step closer. "So," she said, "what happens now?" Ethan asked the question back to himself before answering her. What happened now? That was the inconvenient part. If he took the puppy home, he would need food, a bowl, a leash, probably a bed. There would be vaccinations, a vet appointment, and likely damage to at least one expensive piece of furniture. There would be early mornings, interruptions, noise, fur, unpredictability. He disliked unpredictability. And yet the idea of handing Lulu back suddenly felt much more uncomfortable than it had 20 minutes earlier. I suppose, Ethan said slowly. The first thing that happens now is I determine whether this dog is healthy. He's hungry, Annie said. How do you know? Because he tried to eat part of my shoelace. Ethan stared at her. He what? He thought it was food. That is concerning. I know. Ethan looked at Lulu again. The puppy looked perfectly content now, but the faint outline of his ribs was visible beneath the soft fur. Once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. When was the last time he ate? Ethan asked. Annie thought for a moment. I gave him half my sandwich after school. Ethan turned to her. You gave him your lunch? Half of it. And what did you eat? The other half. He looked at her for a moment longer than he meant to. The answer was not dramatic. She had not said it for praise. She had said it because, to her, that was simply what had happened. Something about that quiet little fact settled heavily in Ethan's chest. You shouldn't have had to do that, he said. Annie shrugged. He was hungrier than me. That was the sort of sentence adults remembered for years. Ethan looked out toward the lake, then back at the girl beside him. Her shoes were worn. Her ribbon had nearly slipped loose from her curls. She was trying very hard to look grown up, but she was still only 6, and the wind was turning colder by the minute. Does your mother know where you are? He asked. She knows I go through the park. That is not exactly the same thing. Annie hesitated. I told her I'd come straight home. Ethan nodded once. And instead, you found a dog, named him Lulu, interviewed a stranger, and placed the dog in his lap. When you say it like that, Annie said, it sounds like a lot. It was a lot. Lulu rolled onto his side again. Ethan looked at the time on his watch, then stood up from the bench with the puppy still in his arms. Annie looked up quickly. Are you taking him? I am taking both of us, Ethan said. To the corner store on Michigan and Elm, because I assume they sell dog food, and because I'm not sending you home after dark without walking you at least part of the way. Annie blinked. You don't have to do that. I'm aware, but you want to? Ethan adjusted Lulu carefully against his coat. The puppy seemed perfectly satisfied with the new arrangement. That remains under review, Ethan said. Annie smiled. Together, they began walking down the path toward the park entrance. The leaves crunched lightly under Ethan's shoes. Annie walked beside him, smaller and quicker, glancing up now and then to make sure Lulu was still there. For a few moments, they walked in silence. Then Annie asked, Do you always talk like that? Like what? Like everything is a business meeting. Ethan looked down at her. Do I? A little. He considered it. That may be a professional hazard. My teacher says some people use big words when they don't want to say what they really feel. Ethan gave her a sideways glance. Your teacher is either very wise or very dangerous. She teaches 2nd grade. That doesn't rule out either possibility. Annie laughed again. The sound followed them all the way to the park gate. By the time they reached the sidewalk, the city had shifted into evening. Cars moved steadily through the intersection. A bus hissed to a stop half a block away. Somewhere nearby, someone was grilling onions, and the smell drifted warmly through the cool air. Annie pointed ahead. There's a little store there. Ethan looked where she was pointing. A neighborhood corner market sat beneath a faded green awning, its front windows glowing yellow. Convenient, he said. He glanced down at Lulu, who had already fallen asleep again in his arms. Either that dog has remarkable trust, Ethan said, or he's exhausted. Both, Annie said. Ethan believed her. He slowed near the curb and looked down at her. Annie. Yes? When we get your supplies, he said, glancing at Lulu. You are going to take me to your building, and I am going to make sure your mother knows you are safe. Annie nodded. That's fair. Good. Then, after a pause, Ethan added, and before you ask, no. This does not mean Lulu is officially staying. Annie looked up at him with bright, knowing eyes. No, she agreed politely. It just means you're buying him dinner. Ethan let out a quiet laugh he hadn't expected from himself. They crossed the street together beneath the first real lights of evening. A billionaire in a dark coat, a 6-year-old girl with too much heart for one small body, and a puppy named Lulu, who had somehow already begun rearranging both of their lives. The bell above the door of the corner market gave a tired little jingle when Ethan pushed it open with his shoulder. Warm air wrapped around them at once, carrying the mixed smells of coffee, detergent, overripe bananas, and the hot rollers turning near the counter. The store was narrow but bright, packed with shelves that seemed to lean slightly toward one another, as if they had been listening to neighborhood stories for years. Lulu stirred in Ethan's arms, blinked once, and then settled again against his coat. A woman at the register looked up over her glasses. "Well," she said, her gaze landing first on Annie, then on Ethan, then finally on the puppy. "That's a picture." Annie smiled politely. Ethan inclined his head, not entirely sure what response that kind of sentence required. The woman behind the counter recognized Annie immediately. "Hey, sugar. Your mama working late again?" Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The woman looked at Ethan once more, curious but not unfriendly. In neighborhoods like this, people noticed everything. They noticed shoes, posture, voices, and who walked in with whom. Ethan could almost feel the weight of the questions she was too polite to ask. Instead, she only said, "Dog food's aisle 3. Pet bowls are near the back." "Thank you," Ethan replied. He started toward the aisle, then glanced at Annie. "You seem to know everyone." Annie followed beside him. "Miss Bernice knows everybody. That appears efficient. She also knows who steals chips. I imagine that's a useful civic function." Annie giggled softly. Aisle 3 contained exactly 4 kinds of dog food. 2 of them in dented cans, and one clearly intended for dogs much larger than Lulu. Ethan stared at the shelf with the expression of a man reviewing an unfavorable contract. "Do puppies eat regular dog food?" he asked. "I think they eat little food," Annie said. "That is not medically specific." Lulu opened one eye as if to suggest he was willing to be flexible. Ethan picked up a bag decorated with a cartoon spaniel. "Chicken and rice formula," he read. "That sounds reasonably harmless." Annie peered at the label. "It says puppy. Then that seems promising." He placed the bag beneath one arm and continued down the aisle. They found 2 stainless steel bowls, a small bag of soft treats, a red leash, and after a brief debate, a tiny red collar. Annie's face brightened when she saw it. "You remembered. I remember that you said red means he belongs." "It does." Ethan glanced down at the collar in his hand. It was simple, cheap, nothing like the carefully selected objects in his home, each one chosen by designers or assistants or people who believed beauty should look expensive. Yet the little red collar seemed to carry more meaning than half the things in his penthouse. He added it to the basket. By the time they reached the register, Lulu had finally woken up for good. He sat up in Ethan's arms and looked around with sleepy curiosity, then tried to chew the edge of Ethan's coat button. "That," Ethan said, gently redirecting the puppy's mouth, "is Italian wool. You are not qualified to eat it." Miss Bernice gave a low chuckle as she rang up the items. "He's cute enough to get away with a lot," she said. "That is my concern," Ethan replied. Annie leaned on the counter slightly. "Can Lulu have a little cup of water?" Miss Bernice smiled. "For that face?" "Of course he can." She disappeared behind the counter and came back with a paper cup half full of water. Lulu drank as if he had been waiting all day for permission. Ethan watched him for a moment. "Hungry and thirsty," he said quietly. "He must have been out there longer than we thought." Annie nodded, her voice softer now. "I know." Miss Bernice placed the receipt in the bag, then looked at Ethan more directly. "You walking her home?" "Yes," Ethan said. She gave one brief nod, apparently satisfied. "Good. No more questions than that." Something about her tone struck him. It was not approval exactly. It was neighborhood accountability. A quiet kind. The sort that said, "We see each other here. We pay attention." As they stepped back outside, the evening had deepened into that blue-gray hour when city lights begin to matter. Cars moved through the intersection with steady purpose. Apartment windows glowed above the street. Somewhere farther down the block, a radio played old soul music through an open storefront. Annie pointed down the sidewalk. "This way." Ethan adjusted the bags in one hand and Lulu in the other. The walk was not long, but it crossed a line he rarely crossed anymore, not physically, but socially. He had spent years moving through private garages, private elevators, private offices, private dinners. Even his acts of generosity were usually filtered through foundations, boards, or carefully managed checks. Walking beside Annie through her neighborhood in the evening with dog food in one hand felt strangely more real than most of those efforts ever had. They passed a laundromat with fogged windows, a barber shop nearly closed for the night, and a church sign out front reading, "Hold on. Joy still comes in the morning." Ethan noticed Annie reading the sign as they passed. "Do you go there?" he asked. "Sometimes." "With your mother?" "Yes." "What do you like about it?" "The singing," Annie said. "And the old ladies who hug too hard." Ethan glanced at her. "That sounds memorable." They smell like flowers and peppermints. He found himself smiling at that. A few doors later, Annie slowed in front of a brick apartment building with chipped paint around the buzzer panel and one porch light flickering weakly above the entrance. "We're here." Ethan looked up at the building. Not dangerous, not broken, just tired. The kind of place that held people working harder than the walls suggested. "You live on which floor?" "Second." He nodded. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cooking oil, bleach, and old radiator heat. Their footsteps echoed on the narrow stairs. Annie reached the landing and stopped at a blue-painted door with a brass number 2B hanging slightly crooked. She looked up at Ethan. "My mom might be embarrassed." "About what?" "The dog stuff. Or me asking you." Ethan considered that. "I'm not here to embarrass her." Annie nodded once and unlocked the door. The apartment was small but neat. A lamp glowed beside a worn couch. On the tiny kitchen table sat a stack of unopened mail, a mug with dried coffee at the bottom, and a folded pair of scrubs. A casserole dish covered in foil rested near the stove, probably left by a neighbor or church friend. The television was off. The silence carried the shape of exhaustion. "Mom?" Annie called. No answer. Annie set the new supplies carefully by the wall. "She's not back yet." Ethan checked the time. "How late does she usually work?" "Sometimes 7. Sometimes later if somebody calls out." He frowned slightly. "You're here alone?" Annie nodded, then added quickly, "Just for a little while. Miss Ruth from downstairs checks on me." As if summoned by name, there was a knock at the door. Annie brightened and opened it. A woman in her late 60s stood there in house slippers and a long cardigan, holding a plate covered with another sheet of foil. "Well, there you are," she said. "I was about to come looking." She stopped when she saw Ethan, and then Lulu. Her eyebrows rose. "Well now," she said, taking in the entire scene with one practiced glance. "This is not what I expected." "Miss Ruth," Annie said quickly, "this is Ethan Caldwell, and this is Lulu." "The dog introduced himself already," Miss Ruth said dryly. Ethan shifted the bags to his other hand and offered a courteous nod. "Good evening." Miss Ruth looked from his coat to his shoes to his face, then back to Annie. She was doing exactly what Miss Bernice had done, taking inventory, measuring intent. Finally, she stepped inside. "I'm Ruth Palmer," she said. "I live downstairs. Danielle asked me to keep an ear out when she gets double shifts." "That seems wise," Ethan replied. "It usually is." Lulu, traitorously social, wagged at her too. Miss Ruth set the covered plate on the table and looked at the dog food on the floor. "So," she said, turning toward Annie, "I'm guessing the dog problem has developed. Maybe into a dog solution," Annie said hopefully. Miss Ruth gave a small sound that might have been amusement. Then the apartment door opened again. Danielle Carter stepped inside, tired enough that she didn't notice Ethan at first. Her scrubs were wrinkled from a long shift, and there was the unmistakable slump of a person who had spent the day caring for everybody except herself. Then she looked up. She saw Annie. She saw Miss Ruth. She saw Ethan Caldwell standing in her living room with a puppy in his arms and a red collar and a shopping bag. And for one long, suspended second, no one said anything at all. Danielle Carter stood in the doorway with one hand still on the knob, the cold evening air slipping in behind her. For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes took in the room in careful pieces. Annie near the table, Miss Ruth in her cardigan and slippers, a tall white man in an expensive dark coat standing in the middle of her small living room, and a tiny golden puppy in his arms, as if the whole scene made perfect sense. Then her gaze landed on Annie. Annie. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the unmistakable strain of a mother who had arrived home already tired and had no room left in the day for surprises. Annie stepped forward immediately. "Mom, I can explain." Danielle shut the door behind her and set her purse on the chair by the wall. "I hope so." Lulu chose that exact moment to let out a soft yip and wag his tail. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. "Oh Lord." Miss Ruth gave a small, sympathetic pat on Danielle's shoulder as she passed. "It's not as bad as it looks," she said. Danielle opened her eyes and looked around the room again. "It looks like my 6-year-old brought home a dog, recruited a stranger, and somehow turned this apartment into a rescue mission." Miss Ruth tilted her head. "Well," she said, "when you put it that way, that's not entirely inaccurate." Despite herself, Danielle almost smiled. Almost. Then she looked at Ethan. He noticed at once what exhaustion had done to her. The careful way she held herself upright. The faint compression marks on the bridge of her nose from a mask worn too long. The dry ache in her eyes. She was a woman who had spent all day tending to other people's needs and had come home expecting at least one thing to be simple. Instead, she found him. Ethan inclined his head politely. "Good evening. My name is Ethan Caldwell." Danielle's expression shifted very slightly. She knew the name, not because she followed business news, but because Chicago was the sort of city where certain names floated through conversations whether people wanted them to or not. Hospitals got supplies from companies like his. Neighborhood development meetings mentioned men like him. People with money had a way of existing in the edges of everybody else's lives. Still, she did not seem impressed. She just looked at Annie. "You met Mr. Caldwell where?" "In the park." Danielle slowly turned back toward Ethan. "In the park?" "Yes. With my dog," Annie added quickly, as if that detail improved matters. Danielle pressed 2 fingers briefly to her forehead. "Annie." "He's not our dog," Annie said, then corrected herself with quiet sorrow. "He can't be." Danielle let out a tired breath. "Baby, I told you that for a reason." "I know. Then why is he here?" The room went quiet for a beat. Annie looked at Lulu, then at Ethan, then finally at her mother. "Because I didn't want to leave him with just anybody." Danielle's face softened, despite the fatigue. That, Ethan noticed, was the dangerous part of Annie. She didn't argue like a child. She loved like one plainly, completely, with no strategy at all. It made resistance harder than it ought to be. Danielle looked at Ethan again. "I'm sorry she dragged you into this." "She didn't drag me," Ethan said calmly. "She asked." Miss Ruth made a low sound in the back of her throat that might have meant, "Fair enough." Danielle slipped out of her coat and laid it over the chair. Her movements were slow now, measured by tiredness. "Annie, why don't you wash your hands?" "I already did." "Then wash them again." Annie understood what that meant. Grown-up conversation. She nodded and disappeared into the tiny bathroom off the hallway. Danielle waited until the water ran before she spoke again. "Mr. Effett, Caldwell. Thank you for walking her home. That was kind. But I hope you understand this can't become something complicated." Ethan looked down at Lulu, who had wriggled higher against his chest. "I'm beginning to understand that complicated arrived before I did." That earned the faintest hint of a smile from Miss Ruth. Danielle crossed her arms loosely, not defensive so much as trying to hold herself together. "My daughter has a very big heart," she said. "Sometimes bigger than our circumstances. She told me as much without quite meaning to." Danielle glanced at the dog supplies by the wall. The bowls, the leash, the food. The little red collar still in its packaging. Her eyes paused there. "You bought all that?" "Yes." "Why?" Ethan considered giving a practical answer, but none of the practical ones felt honest enough. "Because he was hungry," he said. "And because your daughter had already given him half her sandwich." Danielle's gaze shifted to Annie's roomless little corner of the apartment, then back to Ethan. "She did what?" She seemed to think he needed it more. Danielle closed her eyes again, but this time it wasn't frustration. It was the deep, weary ache of a mother who loved her child fiercely and knew exactly where that child had learned to put others first. "She gets that from my father," Danielle said quietly. "And a little from me, I guess." Miss Ruth moved toward the stove. "I'm heating this casserole before I go," she announced. "That child's probably hungry. And so are you." Danielle opened her eyes. "You don't have to do that." "Hush," Miss Ruth replied. "That's why the Lord made old women in ovens." Ethan almost smiled. Danielle noticed. The expression on her face shifted again, just slightly, as though she had expected stiffness from him. Distance, maybe, but not warmth. From the bathroom, Annie called out, "Mom, am I in trouble?" Danielle exhaled. "We'll discuss the meaning of trouble later." "Okay." The faucet shut off. Danielle looked back at Ethan. "What exactly did Annie say to you?" The truth of it sounded strange even now. "She walked up to me in Riverside Park holding the puppy and asked, 'Can you take my dog instead of me?'" Danielle stared at him. Then she laughed once under her breath. The tired kind of laugh that comes from recognition. "That sounds exactly like Annie. She also told me I looked lonely." Danielle's eyebrows lifted. "Oh, she did. Did she?" "She did. And did you?" Ethan paused. The apartment was small enough that silence felt immediate in it. Not empty. Just honest. The table had scratches from daily use. A church calendar hung on the wall. One kitchen drawer didn't close all the way. There was something deeply uncurated about the room. And for perhaps the first time that day, Ethan did not feel the need to perform competence inside it. Yes, he said finally. I suppose I did. Danielle studied him for a moment. Not his coat, not the watch, not the name. Him. She notices things, Danielle said. More than I'd like sometimes, I had the impression. Annie reappeared in the doorway, hands damp, face expectant. Am I still in medium trouble or big trouble? Miss Ruth laughed outright this time. Danielle looked at her daughter and let some of the steel leave her shoulders. Medium, she said. Annie nodded solemnly. That's fair. Then her eyes drifted to Lulu. The puppy saw her and instantly began wagging, nearly launching himself out of Ethan's arms. Annie smiled so quickly it was like watching a light turn on. Ethan noticed Danielle see that too. There were many kinds of poverty in a city like Chicago. Money was only one of them. There was the poverty of time, of rest, of help, of margin. Danielle Carter seemed familiar with all of them, but one thing was unmistakably rich in this room: the love between mother and daughter. Danielle sat down heavily at the table. All right, she said. Tell me exactly what happened from the moment she found him. So Annie did. She told it in pieces, with interruptions and gestures. While Miss Ruth spooned casserole onto plates, and Lulu alternated between wriggling toward Annie and settling deeper into Ethan's hold. Annie described the crying sounds in the grass, the walk home, her mother saying no, the trip to the park, the lonely man on the bench, and the moment Lulu apparently made his own decision. When she got to the part about placing the dog in Ethan's lap, Danielle closed her eyes and shook her head. That was very bold. I was helping, Annie said. You were improvising. It worked. Danielle looked at Ethan. He answered the question she hadn't asked. Yes, he said. It did. Another quiet settled over the room, this one warmer than before. The casserole smelled like cheese and pepper, and the sort of comfort that came from making one dish stretch farther than it should. Lulu had finally calmed enough to let Ethan place him gently on the kitchen floor, where he immediately toddled toward Annie's shoes and sat on them as if guarding something precious. Annie looked down, delighted. He likes staying near people. He does, Ethan said. Danielle followed the puppy with her eyes. Then she looked at the dog food, then at the little red collar, then back at Ethan. You really were serious. I'm not in the habit of buying supplies, ironically. That won a real smile from Miss Ruth, and, to Danielle's visible annoyance, the corner of Danielle's own mouth twitched too. Outside, somewhere down the block, a siren passed and faded. Inside, the apartment felt smaller than before, but not in a bad way. More occupied, more alive. Danielle rested her forearms on the table. Mr. Caldwell, she said carefully. I don't know what Annie expected when she walked up to you in that park. But I do know this: we can't keep that dog here. Not legally, not financially, not any way that lasts. Ethan nodded once. I understand. Annie's face fell, though she tried to hide it. Danielle saw it at once. She reached over and touched her daughter's hand. That doesn't mean he won't be all right. Annie looked from her mother to Ethan, and the next words mattered more than anyone in the room wanted to admit. Will he still have the red collar? Ethan looked at Annie for a moment before answering. Yes, he said quietly. He'll still have the red collar. The relief that crossed her face was small, but unmistakable. Children did not always ask the biggest question first. Sometimes they asked the one that held the rest of their hope inside it. Annie looked down at Lulu, who had now planted himself firmly against her shoes, as if he had already chosen his place in the room. Danielle let out a slow breath and leaned back in her chair. All right, she said. Then let's be clear about what we're talking about. Miss Ruth set down the last plate of casserole and took her own seat without asking permission from anybody. She had the air of a woman who had earned that right years ago. We are talking, Danielle continued, about a puppy my daughter found on the street, a building that does not allow pets, a bank account that does not stretch, and a stranger from the park who somehow ended up buying dog food. A concise summary, Ethan said. Danielle gave him a look that suggested she was still deciding whether his calm tone was reassuring or irritating. And, she added, we are talking about a 6-year-old who gets attached fast. Annie sat up straighter. I don't get attached fast. Miss Ruth looked at her over her glasses. You named him Lulu in under an hour. Annie considered that. That's different. It never is, Miss Ruth murmured. Ethan glanced down at the puppy again. Lulu had found one of Annie's shoelaces and was mouthing it with determined concentration. That seems unhygienic, Ethan said. He thinks everything is food, Annie replied. That is becoming clear. Danielle rested her chin briefly in her hand. I'm not trying to be difficult, she said. I just need to be realistic. Annie hears things with her heart first. I don't always have that luxury. I understand realism, Ethan said. Danielle gave a tired, knowing smile. I imagine you do. He looked around the apartment again. The neat stack of unopened mail, the repaired curtain hem, the church calendar with 2 dates circled in blue ink. Nothing in the room was careless. Everything had been stretched, reused, preserved, managed. This was not a home without discipline. It was a home where discipline had simply never been optional. What would realism look like here? Ethan asked. Danielle answered without hesitation. Realism looks like Lulu not sleeping in this apartment tonight. Annie lowered her eyes. It also looks like... Danielle went on. Softer now. My daughter not thinking she failed him. That changed the room. Ethan saw Annie lift her head again just slightly, as if those words mattered more than the others. You didn't fail him, Danielle said, turning toward her daughter fully now. Do you hear me? Annie nodded once, but I had to give him away. No, Danielle said gently. You tried to make sure he was safe. That's not the same thing. Lulu, entirely unaware of the emotional stakes, sneezed and sat down abruptly on the kitchen floor. Annie smiled despite herself. Miss Ruth pointed her fork toward Ethan. And what does realism look like in your world, Mr. Caldwell? He was not often asked questions that directly in private homes. Usually people asked around him, not at him. He folded one hand over the other and answered honestly. In my world, realism usually means I can solve a problem with money, lawyers, or logistics. Miss Ruth nodded. And can you solve this one that way? Ethan looked at Lulu, then at Annie, then at Danielle. Yes, he said. The practical part of it, certainly. Danielle's gaze sharpened a little. The practical part. Yes. And the rest? He considered that. The rest, he said slowly, depends on whether Lulu is simply a dog in need of a home, or whether he has already become something more important than that. Nobody spoke for a moment. Annie reached down and scooped Lulu gently into her lap. The puppy immediately settled against her as if returning to a place he understood. He's not just a dog, she whispered. Danielle looked at her daughter with that complicated mixture. Only mothers seemed able to manage love, worry, pride, and grief all folded into one expression. I know, she said. The casserole sat warm on the plates now. Miss Ruth began serving Annie before anyone could object. Eat, she said. Nobody makes wise decisions hungry. That, Ethan said, is the soundest policy statement I've heard all day. Miss Ruth handed him a plate too. He looked at it as if unsure what to do. Go on, she said. You bought the dog food. Least we can do is feed the man. Danielle shook her head a little, almost smiling. You don't have to stay. Ethan glanced from her to Annie, and then to Lulu. I think I do. At least until we've settled what happens next. Danielle studied him. There was caution in her. And not without reason. Men with money often arrived in other people's lives with solutions that felt more like control. Offers could become obligations. Kindness could turn condescending very quickly. Ethan recognized the look because he had earned versions of it from many people before, so he kept his tone careful. I'm not here to override you, he said. He's your daughter. You make the decision. I'm only saying the puppy won't go hungry tonight. That landed better. Danielle took a seat again and accepted the plate Miss Ruth placed in front of her. All right, she said quietly. Then maybe we start there. They ate. For a little while, the apartment sounded like forks against plates. A chair shifting across old linoleum, Annie whispering things to Lulu between bites. Ethan had not eaten casserole in years. The food was simple and hot and deeply familiar in a way he had forgotten food could be. It tasted like school nights, church basements, weathering things together. Not elegant, not curated, just honest. Miss Ruth watched him notice that and gave a small nod, as if confirming some private suspicion about him. Annie looked up midway through dinner. If Lulu stays with Mr. Caldwell, she asked. Can I still see him? Danielle set down her fork. Annie. No, that's a fair question, Ethan said. Danielle glanced at him. He continued. If Lulu stays with me, then yes. I think seeing him would be good for both of you. Annie brightened immediately. Really? Yes. How much? Ethan almost smiled. That would depend on schedules, school, and what your mother is comfortable with. Annie turned to Danielle at once. I'm comfortable with a lot, Danielle said dryly. As long as it involves homework getting done and nobody turning my life into a surprise. That seems reasonable, Ethan said. Miss Ruth leaned back in her chair. You know, she said, there are arrangements in life that don't fit neat categories, but they still turn out right. Danielle glanced at her. You mean like what? I mean like neighbors who become family, teachers who become lifelines, church ladies who become emergency childcare, whether anybody planned it or not. She looked at Lulu. And maybe dogs who belong to more than one broken place at a time. That sentence lingered. Ethan saw Annie absorb it without fully understanding why it mattered. Danielle understood it immediately. There are times, Ethan thought, when wealth builds walls so high, a person forgets how many ordinary miracles happen without contracts. He finished the last bite on his plate and set down the fork. Tomorrow, he said, I can take Lulu to a veterinarian. Make sure he's healthy. Vaccinations, age estimate, whatever he needs. Danielle opened her mouth to protest on principle, then closed it again. That would help, she admitted. I know a clinic near downtown that handles rescue intake well. Miss Ruth pointed at him with satisfaction. There, that's a useful rich person sentence. Annie giggled. Danielle rubbed her forehead. I should probably object to the phrasing, but not the offer, Miss Ruth replied. Danielle looked at Ethan again. The caution was still there, but now it sat beside exhaustion and the beginning of gratitude, which was often the harder emotion to manage with dignity. I don't want Annie thinking this ends like a fairy tale, Danielle said quietly. Ethan looked at Annie, who was now feeding Lulu one tiny corner of macaroni under the table when she thought nobody could see. I don't think it does, he said. Danielle frowned slightly. What do you think it is? Ethan considered the question longer than the others expected. I think, he said at last, it might be one good decision followed by another. That's usually how real lives change. Nobody answered immediately, but something in the room softened. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows. Inside, the lamp cast a warm circle over the table, over the tired dishes, and the little red collar still waiting in its package. Over a mother trying not to hope too carelessly, a child already hoping with everything she had, and a man who had not expected to feel needed in a room like this. Annie looked up at him suddenly. Can Lulu wear the collar tonight? Danielle started to say no. Ethan, perhaps unwisely, said, I think that can be arranged. Annie beamed. Lulu wagged as if he had understood every word. And somewhere beneath Danielle Carter's caution, beneath Ethan Caldwell's carefully organized life, and beneath Annie's fierce little heart, something new had begun to take shape. Not ownership, not rescue, something quieter, something closer to belonging. Danielle opened the package with the red collar more carefully than the object required. It was a simple thing, no more expensive than a sandwich and a cup of coffee, but in the small pool of lamplight over the kitchen table, it seemed to carry a weight all its own. Annie leaned forward in her chair.